Alright guys, so I got a pretty wild clip here of a journalist confronting this absolute State Department ghoul here, Matthew Miller, on several different reports that have come out recently of abuse and torture by the IDF. So he's going to specifically ask about a new report that I haven't talked about yet, coming out of some of the medics at Nasser Hospital, which was obviously attacked by the IDF, and they were reporting abuse, as well as that other report that I talked about a couple of days ago coming out of the United Nations, where UNRWA employees were captured by the IDF and then essentially tortured into providing false confessions that the organization had something to do with the October 7th attacks. And so he's going to ask him about both of these different situations and whether or not the IDF is being held accountable by the Israeli government for some of their rampant war crimes that we have all seen them committing over the last 5 months. So let's see his answer here, because there's a couple different interesting things going on.
BBC reported yesterday regarding some medical staff from the Nasser hospital in Khan Yunis. They've interviewed three doctors, or three members of the staff at that hospital, who've given detailed accounts of their detention by Israeli authorities. They told the BBC they were humiliated, beaten, doused with cold water, forced to kneel in uncomfortable positions for hours. One was set upon by a dog. I'm wondering, is that one of these specific cases that you would raise with the Israeli government?
I have only seen the report. I don't know that if we have raised it, but I would expect that we would. It is the type of cases that we often raise with them, to seek more information and to make clear, as we always have, that any detainee should be treated in strict compliance with international humanitarian law.
And more broadly...
Okay, we're going to pause here. We're going to continue it. But I want you guys to notice what he just said, that this is the kind of case that we typically raise with the government of Israel. Meaning, this kind of stuff is coming up a lot, okay, repeatedly. And we are having these conversations about reports, as that guy was just lining out there, of them being forced to kneel in uncomfortable positions and being doused with water and attacked by dogs. And these are the kinds of things that are so standard in terms of the IDF's practices in Gaza that Matthew Miller just, I don't even know if he meant to, but admitted that they're repeatedly having to have these conversations about those specific kinds of things with the IDF. Okay, so pretty interesting admission there from him. Now, whether or not there's ever any accountability on that is a separate question. Let's continue the clip here.
There was also last week a report out of UNRWA about the treatment of UNRWA staff who had been detained by Israeli authorities. So they're sort of piling up allegations, and there's a lot of these accounts are quite similar, right? The treatment of, I guess these tend to be men who are detained presumably on suspicion of being part of Hamas, but given there are numerous of these allegations coming from different places with similar accounts, are you concerned? Are you able to establish from that there might be a pattern here, and is that something that's...
Well, I'd say, first of all, that any detainee ought to be treated in compliance with international humanitarian law. That's what we have impressed upon the Israeli government. And we have seen the IDF come out and make statements to the same effect, to say that they are a professional military. They expect all of their soldiers to behave consistent with their rules of engagement, consistent with the laws of war. And if people make mistakes, they will be disciplined, and we will continue to impress upon them that that's our expectation.
Are you aware of any cases where Israeli troops have been disciplined for mistreating prisoners?
I am aware of cases, I don't know specifically with respect to prisoners, but I know that we recently raised with them an incident where Israeli soldiers were filming themselves inside a mosque inappropriately, and the IDF told us that they were investigating, and if appropriate, there would be accountability and discipline.
But that's a case where there's video evidence. They showed their faces in the video.
Yeah, correct. But it doesn't change what we think the standard ought to be, which is if there are allegations that are substantiated, there ought to be accountability. That's true for the Israeli military. It should be for the United States military and any military anywhere in the world.
Okay, so a couple of different things there. First off, what he just admitted there when he brought up that example of Israeli soldiers filming themselves in an inappropriate way inside of a mosque, okay? And he says that they brought that up and that Israel says they're going to do an investigation, right? They're investigating themselves, guys. Don't worry. I'm sure that they're going to be honest, good faith actors and that they'll hold somebody accountable for that, right? Of course not. But he says that they brought that up to them and that they're doing an investigation, and that after Israel investigates themselves, then they'll determine whether or not they think that the soldiers who participated in that, I don't even know what the specific instance is that he's referring to, but that maybe there could hypothetically be accountability. So it's important to note here, guys, if there had ever, since October 7th, been an example of the Israeli government in a meaningful capacity holding their soldiers accountable for violating the laws of war or international law or human rights law, if there was even one example of that, if it existed, he would bring it up. Okay? So the fact that his response, when the question is, do you have any examples of them actually holding their soldiers accountable, is to bring up a hypothetical example where maybe after some months-long investigation there could potentially be the idea of having mild accountability, that tells you everything. There's never accountability. And I've seen this in so many different State Department briefings in the exact same way that he just delivered it here. You can have video evidence, okay? In some cases, you have video evidence that was posted on social media by the IDF soldiers themselves who are committing the war crimes, laughing about the war crimes, admitting them on camera with their faces showing. You can have examples like that. You can have credible reports from the United Nations, from human rights organizations, from medics and doctors inside of Gaza, from regular civilians inside of Gaza. It does not matter how much evidence you have documented on brazen war crimes committed in broad daylight. You could get up on the podium, show him a video of an IDF soldier committing a war crime and laughing about it, and he still would not admit that they are actually violating international law, that they are actually committing war crimes. The best you could get out of them is, well, we're going to have difficult conversations with our Israeli counterparts behind the scenes. This has happened over and over and over again. And you never actually get to the end point of a follow-up where they say, yeah, that soldier, he's in jail now. Israel actually prosecuted him for committing a war crime. That never happens. Never. It's just this endless cycle of hypotheticals. We believe in international law, and so do our Israeli counterparts, right? We expect them to follow international law, and they expect themselves and their soldiers to follow international law. I mean, it's like a sick joke at this point. They think that we are stupid, okay? They think that we don't have eyes, that we haven't seen every single day since October 7th documented for all of us to see. They think that we just aren't aware of all of the war crimes that have taken place. And at the same time, by the way, you can't come out here and continue to pretend like we are the strong defenders and believers in human rights law and international law and the laws of war. You can't say that when the Biden administration, as South Africa was bringing a case at the International Court of Justice, the highest court in the world, of genocide against Israel, and then the ICJ finds that Israel is plausibly committing a genocide, and then your administration comes out and says that that case is meritless and counterproductive. You can't say that a ruling from the highest court in the world that is supposed to adjudicate international law and international disputes and completely disregard their rulings, and then simultaneously say that you are the arbiters, you are the believers of human rights and international law. I mean, it is just such bullshit at surface level. And in terms of the specifics on the torture reports, right, we have seen so many different examples of this that it's unbelievable, guys. I mean, this was just from Al Jazeera. This is from yesterday. Not just the UNRWA report, countless accounts of Israeli torture in Gaza. And warning, guys, I can't even read you some of the paragraphs in this article because it's genuinely hard to say out loud. That's how gruesome some of this shit is. But I'll give you guys just a small sampling here. They say, according to the February report, UNRWA had documented the release of 1,002 detainees ranging from age 6 to 82. Detainees ranging from age 6 to 82. Important to put a focus on that, right? And this was, detainees at the Karem Abu Salam crossing between December 18th and February 19th. The released detainees included UNRWA staff, women, children, the elderly, and vulnerable people living with conditions like Alzheimer's and cancer, all of whom were taken from Gaza and held at various locations within Israel. They say, quote, in most instances, the released detainees are extremely disoriented, hungry, physically exhausted, and exhibit visible signs of physical and mental trauma, and are wearing dirty clothes, sometimes with visible bloodstains. They say, however, UNRWA noted that the releases it's documented are only part of an overall number of people being detained and mistreated by Israel in Gaza, as there are many more who are taken, tortured, and released within Gaza, and it provided an estimate of some 4,000 people overall who have been potentially subjected to these kinds of torture. They say practices recorded by UNRWA include the use of a nail gun on prisoners' knees, sexual abuse against both men and women, and insertion of what appears to be an electrified metal stick into prisoners' rectums. They got a quote here. They say, they were beating me with an extendable metal bar There was blood on my trousers, and when they saw it, they beat me there. They used a nail gun on my knee. These nails were kept in my knee for about 24 hours until I was transported to the Naqab prison. One 26-year-old male told UNRWA of his 56 days in Israeli custody. They got another one here. Mahmoud Rabu, who's age 62 from Jabalia, told Al Jazeera that he had been displaced to the Indonesian hospital, and during the last days of the Israeli siege on the hospital, emphasize again, the Israeli siege on a hospital. They've destroyed, what, at this point, 31 out of the 36 previously functioning in hospitals in Gaza are no longer functioning at this point. The Israeli siege on the hospital. He was told that everyone should move to the south. Typical, right? He recounts being held in a group. They say he headed for a checkpoint. Sorry, I skipped that paragraph. He headed for a checkpoint that had been determined as safe by Israeli forces, where he and one other man were picked out of a group of 80 people and detained. He recounts being held in a group of more than 100 men who all endured days of beatings, hunger, and cold, adding that they were kept blindfolded, not allowed to sleep, and were forced to spend most of the day kneeling, saying, quote, if someone lifted the blindfold off their eyes, he said, he would be called over to the soldiers and beaten and then strung up on a barbed wire fence. Again, we don't need to go into further detail here, guys. I'll link it down in the description below if you want to go read some of the other testimonies here. It is as gross and gruesome and despicable as you could possibly imagine. And keep in mind, we've seen the images like this of, men in Gaza being rounded up by the dozens at any given time and then stripped down. Sometimes they're put in these like white garments that Israel gives them. Sometimes I've seen them have numbers written on their arms. They're blindfolded and all of that. And then we've seen other instances where they're released in bulk back into Gaza, forced to like walk through the rubble that Israel has created in Gaza. And, we get like statistics showing that 80% of the people they released were just like random civilians, right? Which doesn't even necessarily mean the 20% that they kept were all Hamas militants. But even Israel, the point is, has admitted that a vast majority of the people who they are rounding up like this, many of whom end up being tortured, are just random civilians, okay? Now, to give you a perspective, because obviously we haven't seen any real examples of accountability for these brazen war crimes, we do have examples of praise of war crimes from high-ranking Israeli government officials. This one is from the Minister of Security, Itamar Ben-Gvir, who recently saluted an officer who shot and killed a Palestinian child. So a little bit on that here. They say Israel's Minister of National Security, Itamar Ben-Gvir, praised the killing of a 12-year-old Palestinian boy by a border guard on Tuesday. In a Telegram post, the minister, who is considered an extremist even within Israel's far-right ruling coalition, applauded the soldier and expressed his support for his actions. He said, I support the border guard fighters who are operating at this time and are risking their lives now against dozens of Arab rioters. Okay? He says, I support the soldier who killed the terrorist who tried to shoot fireworks at him and the troops. This is exactly how you should act against the terrorists, with determination and precision. Okay? In video footage capturing the killing, the Palestinian boy was shown playing with fireworks and holding them above his head before he suddenly falls to the ground after being shot. The killing took place in the Shuafat refugee camp near occupied East Jerusalem during what Israeli officials said was a response to a violent disturbance, whatever that means. In a statement, the Israeli police said they fired towards a suspect who endangered the forces, right? I guess endangered the forces in the same way that when Israel committed the Flower massacre, they felt endangered by the Palestinians who were in a panicked rush because Israel was firing on them, right? That was the excuse they gave for massacring civilians who were desperately trying to give aid. Oh, we felt endangered, right? They say after he was shot, family members and other Palestinians could be seen gathering around his body with a woman screaming his name. The child was taken to this Mount Scopus hospital trauma unit where he was pronounced dead. An Israeli police spokesperson said that there were no casualties, conveniently, among the Israelis deployed to the camp. I wonder if there was maybe no threat to them. They say, according to local media, residents of the camp said that the fireworks were not directed at the soldiers and did not pose a danger to the Israelis. Okay, so here you got the Minister of National Security, Itamar Ben-Gvir, somebody who is aggressively in support of the violent and totally illegal expansion of Israeli settlements into West Bank territory, okay? And he's coming out here and praising the killing of a 12-year-old who was shooting off fireworks, okay, in occupied East Jerusalem, which is also illegally occupied, right? So this is the kind of shit that you get from high-ranking Israeli officials, They never talk about this at these press briefings, right? They only ever talk about hypotheticals of holding people accountable for committing hypothetical war crimes, right? They never talk about the fact that we have high-ranking Israeli government officials who are openly praising many of these war crimes. This was another example where the Israeli army acknowledges mistaking a bike for a rocket-propelled grenade, an RPG, in a deadly Gaza strike. So I'm going to play a little bit of this here for you guys. I'm going to mute this so that it doesn't have any sound. But here you see this drone footage that I guess this was initially released by the IDF. And they were initially trying to make the claim that these two guys who are walking here through the middle of the rubble in the street, that he was carrying an RPG in his hand, right? It's outlined here in red. Ooh, it's so scary. And basically you're going to see them, warning, this is not easy to watch, but you're going to see them fire directly on top of these two guys. And, if we can get the video to play here. So, you're going to see them walking along here and, labeled as an RPG, even though it's a bicycle. I think that clearly looks much more like a bicycle to me. But, again, not easy to watch, but this is the kind of shit that the Israeli military is doing in Gaza. So it turns out that later we find out that these two guys were going to get flour, okay? And he was pushing a bicycle along this rubble-filled street. Now, just to do some critical thinking here for a second, what would make somebody believe that that was an RPG? Seriously, do they have the impression that a Hamas militant who's holding an RPG would just be casually strolling down the middle of the street with a drone, a loud drone that they could hear from the ground buzzing above his head, that they're just going to be casually walking down the middle of the street in broad daylight holding an RPG? That's not what Hamas does. If you ever watch any of the videos of Hamas as they are firing on the IDF that's invading Gaza, they're using guerrilla tactics, right? You'll see them sometimes pop out in a window and they're firing through some small area, or maybe they'll run out into the street for a second to get a shot off and then, fall back. This is not what Hamas does. They're not just casually strolling down the middle of the street. So somebody had to make the calculation here that they were going to just blow up these two civilians. And then, obviously lying about it afterwards and saying, no, it was an RPG. It wasn't. It was a bicycle. And these two men were going to try to get flour. Okay? So just another example there. I wonder if Matthew Miller will have anything to say about that. We also had this here from Kenneth Roth. An Israeli tank that killed a Reuters journalist, so this is from months ago at this point, and wounded 6 others in Lebanon last year, fired 2 120mm rounds at a group of, quote, clearly identifiable journalists in violation of international law, a UN investigation has found. So again, I wonder if they're going to comment on this. This is a UN investigation, okay, credible investigation here. You have the Israeli military firing rounds at a group of journalists who are clearly labeled as journalists. Now, this is not the first time we've seen this happen. You don't need to go with just examples since October 7th. I covered, I don't even know how long ago it was at this point, years ago maybe at this point, the assassination of Shireen Abu Akleh, okay, who was a Palestinian journalist who was assassinated in cold blood. And at the time of her killing, she had clearly labeled press vest on, a press helmet. They were, covering on the ground. And, there was no fighting that was happening in the area at the time, despite the IDF coming out later and insisting that there was and lying about it. They then went on to lie and say, no, it wasn't an Israeli sniper that killed her. It was actually a Palestinian resistance fighter that killed her. So they lied about that as well. There were 10 different iterations of lies that came out before they finally admitted that it was the IDF that was responsible for assassinating Shireen Abu Akleh. And even then, what was the accountability in that circumstance? What is the accountability from even the United States government in that circumstance of the killing of a Palestinian-American journalist? Nothing. There's nothing. And then after they assassinated Shireen, guess what they did after? They went to her funeral and they attacked the funeral procession. You guys remember that video of these Israeli security forces going and beating people as they were literally carrying Shireen's coffin through this procession? They attacked her funeral procession, guys, after assassinating her. This widely known, well-respected journalist. There's no accountability, guys. There never is. There never will be. Because for there to be accountability, you have to actually care about the laws of war. You have to care about violations of human rights, of war crimes. You have to care about those things. When your military, when their operating procedure is inherently committing widespread war crimes, when you are engaging in a genocidal campaign, then of course there's not going to be accountability. Of course there's not going to be accountability. And that's the discrepancy here, is Matthew Miller coming out and Biden coming out and the rest of these people coming out constantly insisting that Israel is this democratic state and they desperately care about civilians and they care about following in accordance with international law. And then that being contradicted by literally everything that we see them do in real life. It's just gaslighting. It's just gaslighting. You can't have accountability if the government and the military in question, okay, doesn't think that accountability is necessary because they could give less of a shit about international law or about war crimes. When that's part of the standard operating procedure, what do you expect is going to happen? And I'll finish off with this. Some more statistics that just came out recently. So, I mean, this is kind of alluding to something I've talked about before, but you frequently hear this narrative, right? If they don't acknowledge the actual documented war crimes and they want to speak in general terms, they'll say things like this, right? Well, it's unfortunate, right? Everybody, we all hate, the loss of civilian life, putting it in passive terms, of course. We all hate the loss of innocent lives. The loss of even a single child's life is tragic, right? And we weep for the Palestinians. This is what you'll hear from government officials in the Biden administration. Even the loss of one life is one too many. And it's unfortunate that they're dying. But this is a war, right? What are you going to do? This is what war looks like. Meanwhile, I mean, you can literally add up 2019, 2020, 2021, 2022, all put together, all of the conflicts around the world, and how many children died as a result of that. Israel has killed more children in Gaza in 5 months than those 4 years put together. And we're talking about a comparison of Gaza, a 5-mile by 25-mile strip of land with 2 million people, compared to the entire world. Okay? That's the scale and the speed at which Israel is massacring civilians. And even that graph that I just showed you is actually outdated. So this actually just came out today from Euromed Human Rights Monitor, their latest estimates. 40,000 killed. We've now passed the 40,000 mark. And I told you guys before, when people keep referencing the 30,000 number, that's way outdated at this point, guys. And if anything, this is probably a drastic undercount. It could be tens of thousands more than this, that we just don't have any reliable way to get the real count, because it's impossible. The entirety of the Gaza Strip is rubble now. There's no, legitimate functioning healthcare system to count the amount of people who have been dead or to even try to recover many of the people who are stuck under the rubble. It's not possible to count the amount of people who have been killed so far. But this is their estimate. And even that, 40,000 killed, and almost 15,000 of them have been children. They say 36,000 of them have been civilians. 36,330 out of 40,000 have been civilians. So, I mean, you tell me, guys, when you see Matthew Miller going up there and saying, well, we're raising questions with them behind the scenes, and they care about international law, and I'm sure that one of these days they're going to hold one of their soldiers accountable for committing one of these war crimes or torturing Palestinians or medics or UN workers or whatever the case may be. When you hear him say that kind of shit, do you believe him? I mean, is anybody really supposed to believe them when they come out and say this? If anything, I think that this is really putting the final nail in the coffin in terms of anybody buying for even a fraction of the second that the United States government genuinely cares about international law. That's not how this shit works. If you are one of our designated enemies, then you could bet your ass that we're going to use international law against you, okay, in whatever capacity we possibly can. If you are one of our allies, or if you're the U.S. military themselves, international law does not apply.